welcome back to Supposedly a Film Podcast, where we supposedly talk about film whenever we get around to recording an episode. I'm here with my lovely co-host, Rachel Davies.
Hello.
And I am Tom Adams, and today we're going to be talking about How to Train Your Dragon. Now, this is a very, very big film, very popular. Well, we're going to be talking about all three of them and rating each one in this episode. So yeah, what? I know you love How to Train Your Dragon.
I do. I've watched all three of the films, the two TV shows that are set when they are about 15, 16, I think, and then the Netflix Race to the Edge TV show as well.
Yeah.
Not the Nine Realms. I wouldn't touch that with a barge pole.
Because I remember watching a few episodes of the original Riders of Berk when it aired on CBBC.
CBC.
But then I've never caught up with it, and I did enjoy it. It was fun. Did it have the original voice actors in it, or did they change? Because I know that's
some
quite
of them
popular.
are the original. Some of them aren't. Like I know for a fact that George Clooney, who voices Stoic in the films, didn't do the TV shows.
Yes, that's right.
I can't remember if I can't pronounce the surname. Jay Burchell, is that it?
Yeah.
Who does Hiccup? I don't remember if he does the show.
He has quite a distinct voice, though, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think the person who does Astrid did everything. America
Ferrera, yeah.
Ferrera, yeah. That's the one.
She's become more popular now, obviously, with Barbie coming out. But she was also pretty big, because I remember her being in Ugly Betty, wasn't she?
Yeah, and then she was also in Superstore. Which,
yes.
I don't know how big it was. My mum and my younger sister were obsessed for about a month.
I think Jay Baruchel was the voice of Hiccup in the TV series, if I'm reading the cast list right. But they changed. I think it's not that different. I can't tell, honestly.
No, that was done by Jonah Hill in the film.
Yeah, it's Zach Perlman in the TV series, so they swapped it out.
Yeah.
Which is it's one of those interesting things. I always find it annoying when they have a thing. It's more the reverse that I find frustrating, when they have a TV series and then they make a film and change the voice actors. Especially for like
Sorry, I just want to say this has nothing to do with How to Train Your Dragon.
Go on.
But I would have loved to have watched you watch the Miraculous Ladybug film. Where they changed the voices for the singing.
Oh no!
That would have just been great.
It's like High School Musical. No, that's awful. No.
You have watched that film, haven't you?
I haven't seen the Miraculous Ladybug film. No, I've been meaning to, but then I lost access to Netflix, so I've just not been able to. Well,
we
not
need
legally.
to do an episode on that. No, we don't even need to do an episode on that. You just need to set up a camera pointing at you whilst you watch the film, and then just send me that, because it's less noticeable for Ladybug, but for Cat Noir, the accent changes.
Gosh.
When it starts singing.
Gosh, because he's
sorry.
Yeah, we won't tangent on that, but obviously the films are quite popular. I mean, they went to make 3, so
yeah,
that's not like something they do often, I guess. I don't know, maybe they do, but I feel like the first and second ones were quite good, and the third one was not that great.
Well, I think the third one, going into it, I knew it wasn't going to be my favourite film, because I don't like films that are kind of not necessarily the end of series, but end a series in such a way that it kind of feels like that entire, there's no kind of, and this is what's going on now sort of ending. So like the dragons all leaving feels like a very kind of solid ending. Whereas if it was kind of like we've finished this kind of plot and we've got all the characters to a place where they're happy, but the dragons are still there, I would have been like, that's the sort of ending I'd prefer. But like, I think it's a visually stunning film. The soundtrack's great. It's got all the good points of the other films. It's just not. It's an ending film, and it kind of spent too much time being an ending and not being a film.
I get that. I felt that when I watched it. It was. Yeah, it does. The whole thing does just kind of feel like a close, which is interesting.
Yeah, because like, although there is a plot, you don't really think of the plot when you like think about the film. And like,
and there's nothing in the plot that's like that stands out as well. There's no one like narrative thing that I'm like, wow, that's like the key part of the story. Apart from the the end, the fact that it ends and the dragons leave and they dissociate themselves. Apart from that, there's nothing I'm like. Oh no, that's actually there was one thing I found really interesting, which was the villain. The villain of the third film, I actually quite liked, because there's one moment where you kind of realize that what the villain is very much just kind of a dark version of Hiccup, which I think is actually quite nice and like almost poetic, I guess, in that like he's very much what Hiccup could have become if he had not been so kind-hearted and well-spirited towards the dragons.
Yeah, I think like he's got great potential as a villain. They just don't use that enough.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And like, there are a few moments where I'm kind of like, that was a really cool moment, and the way they did it was really kind of stunning. And there's one scene that comes to mind where they're in the so the chief's hut, the hut that Hiccup grew up in, and it ends up getting destroyed when this guy attacks. And I'm like, that's a really great scene, and I always think about it when I think about the third film. But that's kind of really, there's only two moments that kind of feel like that throughout the film, that feel like there's a kind of proper threat going on.
Yeah.
And it does kind of feel a bit more like we're destroying this stuff and destroying that stuff so that we can give you an all kind of new beginning, but it is just all just endings throughout. And I do think, like, I think his name's Grimmel or something, the villain. Like, he's a very interesting villain, but they don't go into it enough to kind of make the elements of him being the opposite of Hiccup and like what Hiccup could have become kind of really meaningful. Whereas you kind of get like with Drago from the second film, he's a very strong villain because they spent time kind of focusing on him outside of Hiccup's relationship with Toothless. He feels like a person and a character rather than a plot device and like a mirror to Hiccup, but a plot device all the same.
Yeah. I mean, that was you're right. That was good. Like the fact that Stoic was scared of the guy. What's his name?
Drago.
Drago. Yeah, that was it. The fact that Stoic's scared of Drago, and then we have the flashback of the chieftains. It's quite like it's not too like much time in the film, which is good because it means that the runtime isn't just spent in the backstory, but like in terms of plot significance, like you say, that really changes the dynamic of the villain, because it's like, oh, this guy is a problem. Whereas I think Grimmel, he just kind of came up and was just kind of there, and then did some stuff, and then was defeated, and it was like, okay. And I don't know. I think both the second one and the third one have the problem of like an unexplained success, in the terms of like it's just an ex machina that they just decided was the way they were going to win. There was nothing explained about how this stuff works. There was nothing explained about, the development of Toothless becoming some like weird electric dragon thing. It just kind of happened, and that was because he did that. That meant they could win. And then similarly with the Light Furies, it was just kind of like, oh yeah, they exist, and also have the ability to like teleport, which we're not going to expand upon. And that's just a bit like, okay.
I think with the especially with the second film, where because they had the TV series that was the run up to the second film, they could have expanded a lot more on Toothless's abilities,
probably,
and kind of had this development of what Toothless can do. Because in the show, like Hiccup's glide suit, that that comes about in the show, and then they don't really explain it in the second film. You just kind of think, oh well, Hiccup has developed as a person, he's invented this suit, and they don't go into detail about the inventing process. So like, if you are really into the fandom, you can get the answers, but it's something that you don't necessarily need to know. And I think if they'd have done kind of into the second film, just had like they're all kind of maturing, and like Toothless has some extra abilities that he's kind of struggling with from the beginning. That would have worked better if they had to go down the extra abilities route. But yeah, I just think like he doesn't necessarily need them to win.
But also they barely come up in the third film as well. Like, he has this I don't even know. This is the thing. You don't even really like know what the power is. Like, he goes all blue, and like, what is it? Is his like fire now more strong, or like whatever, the plasma stuff, or is it like I don't know. And then it's not even something they talk about in the third film, or really, like, I don't remember any part of it really coming up.
See, I find all media like this, where they've introduced large kind of collections of species and then not produced a book or a TV show or something that goes into details about the universe. Like, I think a How to Train Your Dragon book that's just like, because they have the book of dragons.
The book they have in
the book that's based off that would be great. And then another thing that, I'm always thinking about this, in Lockwood and Co., if they had a kind of, these are all the different ghosts and these are the rules about them. But then you I get them not wanting to do that, because if you set these are the clear rules, by the time the second film comes around, and then you're like, actually, we do need to give Toothless some extra superpowers for the third film. You don't want to have committed to a set of rules for that. But
I can
we
see.
haven't really talked about the first film.
I mean, I feel like the first film is definitely my favorite one. Same. But I think I think part of that is nostalgia, right? Because I remember watching it with my friends and like hearing, obviously the soundtrack is impeccable. The narrative is just like so well done. And it's such like a magical film. I feel like so much of that comes down to the fact that I watched it as a kid, and like I was definitely the target audience. And it's like definitely left an impression on me, which just kind of then also makes the second two worse, because obviously the second two came out later, as you know how films work, and
unless it's Star Wars.
So true. But obviously the films came out when I was older, and so I didn't have the same nostalgia to link to it. And not only that, but I was comparing them to the nostalgia I felt from the first film, which was arguably inachievable because I wasn't a kid anymore, and I couldn't have that same sense of kind of awe and wonder from what it was trying to deliver. But it's such a popular film. It's such a famous film. Like, I love rewatching it. I think I rewatched the series last year, and it's definitely one of those things that you know, I think people I try and rewatch them, you know, almost yearly.
You have a special day of the year where you just binge all three of them.
I should. I don't, but I definitely should. Well, I mean, I could admit, honestly, I could miss the third one. I wouldn't mind. Like the first two are fine to do, and then the third one, I'm honestly like, I could leave it.
Yeah. See, so I watched the first one when I was a kid as well. Probably close to thousands of times. Because my parents would used to put it on. We had like 3 films that my parents would put on when there was a group of kids in the house, because they were films that like they knew wouldn't offend anyone's parents. And How to Train Your Dragon was one of those. So I probably watched it like a thousand times. The other ones was 1, 2, 3 Penguins Go. I cannot remember the final one. The final one was a VeggieTales one.
Oh, I loved VeggieTales. I want to know about this 1, 2, 3 Penguins Go.
The Moses VeggieTales thing. It was 1, 2, 3 Penguins Go, and it was about this chess game. And Tarzan. Tarzan was another.
3, 2, 1 Penguins.
It could be 3, 2, 1 Penguins.
An American sci-fi computer animated Christian children's television series.
Yes.
Initially launched on November 2000 as a direct-to-video episode.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Wow, that's incredible.
So you can tell why How to Train Your Dragon.
Yeah, it definitely would have stuck out in the
because it wasn't the penguin with
the little
quiff.
Club, right?
And I was avoiding the penguin with the quiff.
Yeah, the penguin with the I'm looking at images now. It does not look. I can definitely see why How to Train Your Dragon would have stood out between 3, 2, 1 Penguins and VeggieTales.
Yeah. So I watched that loads and loads of times and got sick of it at one point, but then kind of after I had a bit of distance from it and was no longer like, oh, it's not this again. I think like the storyline and the characters, and like Hiccup, I've joked many times, was my teenage internal monologue. Like the way he talked was the way I viewed the world as a teenager.
No, I understand that. Yeah.
So I think I kind of felt, because also always a bit of a weirdo growing up, I kind of felt like I can see myself in Hiccup. And then, I can't remember when the second film came out. I probably was a teenager when that came out. And
second film was 2014.
So I would have been 14, 15 for the second film, if that's right. Which, so kind of outside of the target audience, but I still really liked it. But I think I preferred the first film. The first one's my favourite because it doesn't have like a human villain. And like I think DreamWorks does really good human villains, and like, well, not always human, but really good kind of villains who can talk and explain their motivations. But there was just something really good about how, like, not only were the people that kind of been set up at the beginning of being the villains not the actual villains, so like Stoic wasn't a bad person, he just was misguided, and the dragons weren't bad, they were just being controlled. And I think because they didn't have to have a human villain and explain all the motivations for them and kind of dwell on the moments that they had with all the other characters, you could spend a lot more time on what I think is one of the biggest kind of like the best elements of the series, which is the relationship between Hiccup and Toothless. And like you have that I think it's about 5 minutes long scene where there's no talking, and it's just Hiccup and Toothless spending time together, and getting to know each other, and it
Oh, the
ends with
montage, yeah.
the like Hiccup touching Toothless on the head, and like you don't kind of have time for that in the other films.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the main reason I prefer the first one. And then also the fact that like a character in a mainstream children's film becomes disabled
Yeah.
during the film.
Yeah.
And like I know there are some where they are disabled throughout, and like that's good, but kind of having a character who is seen as normal throughout the entire film and then kind of at the end have this
Yeah.
change, they're still the same character. I think that is just a good thing to show kids
Yeah,
that
definitely.
like um and yeah, I think it's just, and then also the way they deal with the disability in the various films and TV shows, they do a lot on it. Like not kind of entire episodes about it in the TV show, but there's a lot of little references to it throughout,
Yeah.
and it's not kind of a forgotten
That's good.
element of it.
Yeah.
Like there's I can think of kind of three moments off the top of my head where there's a group of little dragons that steal metal, and Hiccup has a metal leg. So kind of every time they fight them, it gets brought into focus that he's got this metal leg because they go for it. And then
Ah.
there's another time where him and Snotlout are arguing, and Snotlout's like, "Oh yeah, Hiccup's so special. He's got the metal leg," and Hiccup's like, "Why are you saying that? That's not what makes me special." Um, which I think's a really good kind of moment of like
Yeah.
Snotlout being kind of you're weird and special because you get all these things, and Hiccup being like, "Well, this doesn't make me special. It's a disability. It's not a kind of status symbol."
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they also in a final, no, in the Netflix Race to the Edge show, they have an episode where Hiccup's being kidnapped and someone actually takes his leg from him. And I think that's just kind of a really
Yeah.
interesting thing to do in a kids show, because like it kind of shows this is something he is dealing with
Mm.
and a weakness he has, and not kind of necessarily going over the top with like, oh yeah, disabilities are a superpower and every disabled person needs to feel empowered 100% of the time and they're so inspiring. It's like, no, this is something that is a weakness, and
Yeah.
someone is taking advantage of the fact that he now cannot run
Yeah.
because they've taken his leg.
Yeah.
Um,
That's really interesting.
and I think it's just good that the show doesn't shy away from it, and even in the films, although they
Yeah.
don't kind of go into big moments like that, they have. I think in the second film it shows that he's got like his prosthetic has different, not attachments, but like modes that
Yeah.
flip
Yeah. Yeah.
around,
Yeah.
to kind of show that he's found a way of incorporating it into his life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very cool. Yeah. I've always admired how they've done that. And of course, I've not seen the series, so I haven't seen that depiction. But yeah, that's always been something. I think it's a very subtle thing that has definitely set it apart, especially as a kids' film. But something you said made me think about the something I think that really, really separates the first film from the second two, is just the simplicity of the narrative. So in the first film, the essential beats are you have Hiccup, and he's in a place where the Vikings hate the dragons. He goes out,
Yeah.
he captures a dragon. He realizes that the dragons aren't bad. Tries to persuade the town. They all don't care, and then they end up, in this big fight. They find out the dragons aren't bad, and then the end. And like those are quite simple beats. Like they're quite significant. They're quite separated, but they're quite simple. Like there's not a complicated narrative. So you have a lot of time, like you were saying, you have a lot of time to really build on the relationship of Hiccup and Toothless. You have a lot of time to even build on the relationship of Hiccup and his father, which they do a bit, and maybe they could have done more. But there's little bits of dialogue which are very well written, which kind of allude to the relationship they have, and how Stoic's very overbearing as a father, and expects a lot from his son and all this other stuff, and that's communicated very well. Whereas in the second two films, the narrative is very complicated. They're moving around a lot. They're going to different places. In the second one, we start out and Hiccup's like out exploring, and there's this race going on, and then he comes back, and then we find out that he's like, there's talks of him being chieftain, and then I can't remember exactly what happens, but like something happens, so they have to leave again, and then there's this big plot twist where they find out his mother's alive, but I think that's slightly later. Oh no, they find the dragon snatchers, and then they find out his mother's alive, and then they find out this guy's trying to attack Burke, and then you find out who the guy is, and then you find out that he's trying to take over with the alphas, and then he's taken one, and then he spoilers, he kills Stoic, and then they go back and they fight, and like there's so much in it. And they're constantly moving, they're constantly going from thing to thing, and there's very few very like significant beats that are like, this is a point in the story, whereas with you've got like his death, you've got Stoic's death, and you've got like the mum coming back and that kind of thing, but apart from that, it's very just kind of fluid and very like just thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. And it's exactly the same with the third film. Obviously, like they get attacked, and then they leave Burke, and they have to move, and they're literally just on the move the whole film, and so it really takes away from the time they have to sit down and like you say, have these like times of development, and these moments of kind of just nothing, which are actually the most important times, because that's when the relationships are developed.
I also think for the second and third films, although like roughly the same number of characters are there, in the first one you could say there's really kind of 5 main characters. There's Hiccup, Toothless, Stoic, Astrid, and then you could argue Gobber is another main character.
Sure.
The dad's best friend, because he's kind of like a second parental influence.
Sure, yeah.
But kind of those are the only ones who are necessarily making big plot decisions, really.
Yeah.
Well, the Red Death as well, but like they're the ones who are really driving forwards the plot. Whereas when you go into the second and third film, like probably because of the TV shows, they've developed the other characters so much that kind of you need to have a plot line for Snotlout, you need to have a plot line for Fishlegs, you need to have a plot line for the twins, and it's kind of adding all these extra plots in that aren't really needed in the grand scheme of things, but they're kind of having to include them out of this obligation to the show. Whereas kind of, although I think in the first film they do really well with the other teenagers, and like especially the way they kind of,
I would argue that the first film treats Gobber and specifically the teenagers as one entity, in terms of narrative. That whole thing, that like training thing, is very much one entity of narrative, and obviously you then have the development of them, of the teenagers coming out with Hiccup, with the dragons to save the day, but there's no individuality in those people. They are one entity of the teenagers, the cool kids, specifically in the first thing. And I think you're very right that as it's developed, it becomes much harder to have that kind of one entity thing, because you've developed them. I'd say there's one thing that I really admire about Star Wars, actually, and it's a bit off topic, is the way that, and Star Wars does this really well, is that they kind of pick pick like things mentioned and then just expand upon them from other projects. So you have the original Star Wars trilogy, and in the original Star Wars trilogy, they mention the Clone Wars. And so then you have the prequels, and then after the prequels come out, you have a whole 8-series TV series based around the Clone Wars. And similarly, there's like a one throwaway line in A New Hope, the 4th film, where the Admiral Akbar says, you know, some boffins died getting this information of the Death Star. And then they make a whole film about those people. And so it's a much better way of thinking about it and doing that kind of narrative expansion, where you don't knit yourself into a corner like I think the How to Train Your Dragon films have done, like you're saying. Because you're intentionally expanding upon something that doesn't need to be expanded upon, but it also doesn't limit your ability later on, because the thing's already kind of been made, if that makes sense. Like, they can't go back to A New Hope and talk more about the Clone Wars because it's already there. Whereas they're picking points and being like, let's expand upon this, which I think is a much better way of doing it. And again, something I think the Dragons films probably kind of lacked on, unfortunately.
I think part of the issue with that is that, like, DreamWorks probably is never going to have the budget to kind of throw money at How to Train Dragon like Star Wars can throw. Disney can throw money at Star Wars.
Yeah, of course.
And I think also, like, they kind of decided they weren't going to do any TV shows after they ended Race to the Edge, and therefore led into the second film.
Interesting.
But I do think that kind of a TV show for, like, around the events of the third film and kind of the lead up would have been a lot better. It's like, even if you kind of took, because they don't go to any of the places from Race to the Edge in the second film. Like, most of the stuff in Race to the Edge is just kind of setting up a conflict that doesn't really matter, and then they're kind of like, oh, but this guy's actually working for Drago, and like they introduce the idea of dragon hunters and stuff like that. But they don't go into too much detail about the second film, whereas especially for the third film, where they're kind of like, oh, Burke has all these problems now, it would have been like, that could have been a really interesting time to see that develop. But on the same route, I'm kind of like, there are villains in the, especially Defenders of Burke and Riders of Burke, some of the villains in there, I'm like, they could have made a very good film involving that person as the main villain. And I don't know how much of it you watched, but there's Alvin the Treacherous, who is, I'm pretty sure, the main villain in the book series.
It rings a bell.
And he's the main villain in Defenders of Burke. No, Riders of Burke, that's the first one. He's the main villain in Riders of Burke. And I think he could have been a very good villain. And he kind of has very similar strokes to Drago, in the sense of he's someone who Stoic knew in the past, someone who is trying to control the dragons through his own way, or at least try and get a way to control dragons, because he's trying to get Hiccup to train the dragons for him.
Right.
Yeah. And I think he could have been almost a better villain, because also he probably would have known Hiccup's mum. So you could have had that element in and kind of had a bit more of like this guy knows their family, and more of the relationship element from that respect. But also, I think he's just a more fun villain as well.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Not that there's anything wrong with Drago. He is a very good villain, and DreamWorks does make very good villains in general. But I'm just kind of thinking, now we're kind of talking about like, oh, maybe this could have been in a TV show, maybe this could have been in a film. One thing from the first film that I think they do amazing, that very few people comment on, is the fact that when you're first watching the film, you don't look at the dragons and be like, oh, that dragon's gonna go with Astrid, that one's gonna go with the twins,
Yeah.
that one's gonna go with fish legs. But after you see them all kind of paired up, when you like see them all in a row, you immediately are like, oh yeah, those are the dragon equivalents of these
Yes.
characters.
Yeah.
And I think they do that really well. That like they're so obviously matched up,
Yeah.
but it's done in such a kind of subtle way, and the way they kind of
They
have
must have
them
reverse engineered that.
appearing
It
in
must have
different
been.
orders. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a very good way of
I
doing it.
I just think that's something that's done so well.
Yeah.
Um, and they do a great job of matching up dragons with people throughout the shows and the films in general. All of the
Yeah.
dragons kind of
Oh, I
because
love Stoic's dragon. He matches
the
him so.
Rumblehorn.
Yeah, he matches him so perfectly. And then similarly with Stoic's friend, I can't remember the name of him.
Gobber.
Gobber, yes, that's it.
And his dragon,
He's very
Grunt.
specifically set to him. It's very good. Anyway, I want to try and keep this episode slightly shorter, so let's move on to rating the films. We can start with let's start with the third one. Let's go backwards.
Okay.
So overall, I think my personal thing with the third one is it was just fine. It was like it didn't. It was a. I think it was a nice way of ending the series. Wasn't necessarily the best way they could have done it. I can imagine better ways they did it. I think the film could have been executed better, especially as an ending. But I can see kind of the sentiment they were going for, and I think as someone who the film's meant so much to as like a kid, I think I cried when I watched it first, just because it was like I was more thinking about the first one and like how much that meant to me and like how that was over now, and so it was still a good solid ending, but it has a lot of flaws. I would put it at like a 5. I think just a middle of the road. Don't hate it, don't love it. 5. What do you think?
Yeah, so I've got very kind of similar thoughts to you about it. Like, I also cried when I watched it. I was at the cinema, whilst I was at uni as well. So like, there were people on my course in the room, and I was like, I'm trying my hardest not to cry, but I am going to start crying. And yeah, so I like. It is very kind of, it's the end of an era almost. It's a film series film and TV series, like, it's a franchise that I grew up with.
Yeah.
So kind of, I knew that it wasn't going to have to do much to kind of get my emotions going.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, although it is a very technically good film and it's kind of got all the good music, all the good visuals, it's not my sort of film either.
Mm-hmm.
Like I as I said, I don't like films that are just kind of endings.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like it's the worst one of the trilogy. So I'm probably also gonna give it a 5.
Fair enough.
Maybe
Yeah.
5.5. I'd say
5.5. We'll go with that. Sweet. So moving on to the second film then. I think the second film has grown on me over the years. I mean, I say over the years. It came out 10 years ago. Over the 10 years, I think initially it was a shock because it just wasn't as good as it definitely didn't have a lot of the magic of the first film. And as a little 12-year-old boy going into the film thinking, oh, I loved the first one, let's see the second. And obviously not having as good a knowledge of how sequels are never as good as the originals. I think it was a shock to me to watch the second one and see how it played out. That being said, I think as I've, grown up and kind of watched the series again and again, it is gotten better in my eyes. I think it does some really nice things. It's a very entertaining film. Not very like it doesn't push too much like narrative, or it doesn't. What am I trying to say? It doesn't push too much of like a message. It just kind of is entertaining to watch, which is arguably a fault depending on what you seek from a film. But sometimes people just want to be entertained, and that's perfectly okay. It's definitely a film that I would like choose to watch again. I enjoyed watching it. So I think I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10, simply for like the fact that I'd want to rewatch it. I think, yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the second film isn't as good as the first, but I think kind of if you put it in a kind of playing field against lots of other different films,
That's true,
even if you just limited it to sequels, it is still a very good film.
Yeah.
And all of the emotions they're trying to kind of convey come across really well, and I don't know of anyone who can say that they haven't teared up at least once watching the second film, and specifically all of the stuff around Stoic and kind of feeling stuff like that, even if they hadn't watched the film as a kid. Just the fact that he is kind of this very, although he does seem somewhat detached at times, a very loving person who just wants to do right by his son in the first film and then his family in the second film. So kind of I think emotionally it's really good. Visually, all the films are visually stunning. And the plot is trying to do a lot of stuff, but if you can kind of almost forget some of the clutter, it's a very good film. And compared to films doing too much, there are a lot of films that do a lot worse. And heralded as brilliant things. So yeah, I'd give it definitely a 7.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Solid 7. We like that. Moving on to the last film. The first film. Then, this is a very good film in my eyes. Constantly, I think about it. Okay, I've opened this sentence a bit weird. I don't think about it that often.
It's your Roman Empire. You think about it once a day.
No, I think about it, enough. Like, it's when people mention, the greatest animated films in history of all time, it is definitely in my mind as one of them. I think I love it. The soundtrack specifically is amazing. The use of music in the film, the narrative, the message they try and push, through the narrative, the relationships they show, all of the characters are fun. It's entertaining. Again, it's got that nostalgia factor, which is just kind of luck because I was the right age when it came out. All that stuff. I am quite. I think I will say this before I rate it because I don't want the number to sound worse than it is, but I'm quite blunt with my ratings, so I'm gonna give it an 8. And so oof. I think 8 is very good. 9, I think I downloaded Letterboxd recently, which is an app that lets you rate films. I think I have maybe 12 9s on there out of 600 films that I've rated, and only one 10-star. So 8 is very significant.
What's the 1 10-star?
Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Oh no, that's horrific.
It's personal preference, okay? I acknowledge I acknowledge that it's not the best film of all time. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm saying that out of all the films in the world, Scott Pilgrim is the one that I like the most and will
Say
continue
that
to
like
like the most.
my favorite film is some great masterpiece. Um, my favorite film, Shazam.
Goodness. Shazam. Wow.
Okay,
Let's
so
not talk about Shazam. I just don't want to. I'm rating the first How to Train Dragon. I'm rating it an 8. Yeah.
okay. Well, as I said, my first favorite film is Shazam, but my second favorite film is the How to Train Your Dragon first film. And it's my favorite animated film. I just think like it's just such a good film, and there's no real faults in it. They do all the overt emotion really well. They do lots of really subtle emotion, which especially at the time for animation would have been very hard.
Yeah.
Toothless looks amazing.
Yeah.
Way they've like made Hiccup look like a normal person. I know in the second and third film he goes like he has the world's most insane glow up. But like he looks like a normal gangly teenager in the first film, which I think is a very bold choice, especially when you're starting off a franchise.
Yeah.
The world building is brilliant, the characters brilliant, music astounding.
Yeah.
Like is just an amazing film.
Yeah.
And so of course I'm gonna give it a 10 because I have taste and don't like Scott Pilgrim.
Wow. But
Yeah.
I'm also of the opinion that you can only really have one 10. So I mean that's my take.
No, there are two like impeccable films. There are two films you cannot flaw, and that is the first How to Train Your Dragon and the first Shazam film.
That is
the
not
second Shazam
that is
film
not
is trash, but it deserves a 9 anyway.
Oh gosh, no, we can't rate Shazam. No, you can't rate the second Shazam a 9. Anyway, that's off topic.
I watched it in D-Box. Seats were moving. It was amazing.
That does actually sound like an experience.
I have a poster for the second film up in my room.
Amazing. Posters are great. Okay, so wait, what did we rate the films? The third one was 5, the second one was 6, and the first one was 8.
You did 8 for that, and then mine was 5.5, 7, and then 10.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's fair. Well, there you go. That's our ratings. That's our opinions on the How to Train Your Dragon films. We did forget to talk about the live action film that's coming out next year. I
am so excited for that. I've been saying since Disney started doing their live action obsession, I've been like, those are not the films you should be remaking as live action films. The only one I would have been like, that deserves a live action film was Mulan, but they changed the plot of it so dramatically.
I never watched it, but I didn't hear it was very good. So
they keep making what are essentially romance films live action. Like, no, because
there are some awful live action, like The Lion King. I don't know why they decided to make The Lion King live action.
Because it's not live action; it's just updated animation.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. And you lose so much of the essence because with cartoon animation you get so much energy and like emotion from the things because they're not alive. That's like that lions don't make those faces. They don't have those expressions. And so to try and put it on a real light is just stupid. It's just dumb. Anyway,
with How to Train Your Dragon one, I've always said that I think that they should have a live action one because a lot of people dismiss the film series because it's animated and they're like, oh, it's just a kids' film.
Okay.
And I think the action pieces and like all of the kind of fighting and stuff would look so good in live action. because they've made it a very realistic style. Like, it's not cartoon fighting; it's a very realistic way of fighting in the original. But also, it would just up the danger level to be able to kind of like, to make it feel real, and like
that's one thing
Toothless
that was
can be very
definitely
cartoony at times.
Yeah.
Go on.
That's one thing that was definitely communicated through the live action adaptation of the Avatar animated series. Was the live action felt so much more dramatic and threatening, because you were playing with real fire, you were playing with actual rocks and stuff. Like, it wasn't just, colors and drawings, which I'm not one to dismiss animation, but I think that was definitely something that was translated differently in the live action adaptation was and it can be, I think you're right that it will be translated differently in the film, is the danger level.
Yeah, because I wouldn't be surprised, and I almost hope they do make the live action a 12, because
I can imagine that. Yeah.
The Red Death threat at the end is kind of like almost a I've completely forgotten what it's called. It begins with a G. The Japanese nuclear waste lizard.
Godzilla.
Godzilla. It's like a Godzilla level threat.
Japanese nuclear waste lizard.
That's what it is.
That sounds like something they'd name it to make it distinct legally from Godzilla.
Yeah. But I'm just saying, like, it's that sort of level of threat almost, and like all of those kind of dramatic shots you get for Godzilla versus Kong and King of Monsters and stuff, where like creatures rampaging through an area and debris going everywhere. You have that in the animated film, and it would just look so much better if it was a live action CGI sort of setup.
Yeah,
I just think that would kind of
it'll be good, and it'll be interesting. I think we can definitely do an episode on it when it comes out. But I'm holding my expectations at arm's distance, because I expectations of films, especially live actions, can be greatly hit or miss. Like, it's quite the roller coaster, to be honest. So I'm woefully cautious. But
I'm willing to be hurt over this. I am going to be there on opening night.
That's fair enough.
Going to see it with moving seats in 3D.
Well, that's
going whole hog.
That's up to you. You can choose to do that.
To be hurt.
Fair enough. Well, I'll outro us out then. So yeah, that was our take on the How to Train Your Dragon films. We'll be sure to do an episode of the live action when it comes out. I think it's next year. Yeah, next year.
That'll probably be our next episode.
Probably be our next episode. There was no need for that kind of attitude, but it's very true. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed, and we will see you in the next episode, whenever that will be.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. Amazing. Cool. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.